All right, so we're starting the book of Exodus, and the book of Exodus, again, it takes Israel from a wandering, nomadic people who are camping out in the land that was promised to them but don't really have a home, to taking them into Egypt to protect them with Joseph as he was elevated into that position by God's design, to 430 years later, bringing them back out. And that is the first half of the book of Exodus, is that process of bringing them back out of Egypt. Now, as he does it, it's interesting because the way that it works is that he was able to allow them to prosper and flourish over 430 years. You have the 12 sons who represent the 12 tribes of Israel become a group of 3 to 5 million people in 430 years. So, one of the things that you always have a problem with evolution is that they always want to talk about how the earth couldn't have been that populated, they couldn't have been that smart, they couldn't have been that skilled with metallurgy or anything else, and they talk about, ancient people like cavemen all the time. The pre-flood world had millions and millions of people, and it would have easily been populated, to that level. And here you have a people group, while blessed, are able to, in 430 years, populate into millions. And so it's not a stretch to think of the ancient world as very sophisticated and populated, and it was. So we're in this period of time.
Do they know roughly what the Egyptian population was at the time?
Yeah, you would have had, I'll say millions. Certainly millions. It was, because you're in a dynastic area of Egypt at this time, it was a high period for Egypt. The building projects in Egypt were surpassing anything that the nations around them were doing in terms of its permanence, right? Permanent kind of building constructions versus tent dwelling and nomadic. And, the city constructions were not as sophisticated as the Egyptians at this time. So they had the kind of the most modern civilization of its time.
But short of not having weapons, could they have risen up and overthrown Egypt with the number of people they had?
The concern was real, yeah. Yeah, they might not have been on an equal footing. Egypt might have been slightly more populated, but they looked at them, number one, they looked at their slavery as, we're training them to be strong and, skilled with their hands. So it's not just a middle-class people group that we got to train. This is they're fighting ready, in that sense. That's how they looked at them. Because we're making them work hard, they're obviously a lot stronger and more fit and ready to go. Anytime they don't like it, they're going to realize that they can turn on us. Why are we listening to them? So in terms of the size of the army, they may have equated the size of the army to the men of Israel and said, we might lose that one. Maybe not the whole population, but the size of the army. For sure. So that's kind of the situation that comes in. Now you realize as they're coming out, they come out with a gross domestic product. They come out of Egypt with a nation in a can, right? As they're leaving, God said, remember, ask for all their gold and silver and take it with you. And, for some mysterious reason, the Egyptians go, yeah, that sounds like a great idea. Take all of our stuff with you. So when they go into the land, they're not going in poor. They're not even going in with their own stuff. They're taking Egypt's stuff and starting a whole nation and an economy with it from day one. We have everything we need to start an economic, capacity for economic growth right from the get-go. So God provided for them in every way that He did that. And we're going to get into the whole outline here. So the theme verse in Exodus chapter 6 is this, and I'm using the Legacy Standard because I think in Exodus especially it draws out an important aspect about God displaying Himself, and that He uses His name. It says, "Say therefore to the sons of Israel, I am Yahweh, and I will bring you out from under the hard labors of the Egyptians, and I will deliver you from their slavery." And then the promise is continued this way, "I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and great judgments." And I think you have reference that God is saying, I'm remembering my promise to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, and this redemption is tied to that promise. And so it's a great verse that He is revealing Himself in that way as who He is. And the display that He's putting on is not just, Elohim God or Adonai Lord, but He says personally, I am Yahweh. And He uses a personal name here, especially as He kind of displays Himself and His power against the perceived might and strength of the gods of Egypt. They have names, so God uses His name. And I think that's a personal aspect that we lose a lot of times in translation, that in Exodus becomes pretty important. So I've been reading and using the Legacy Standard just for the reason of getting that flavor of how God reveals Himself in Exodus to be this personal Yahweh and His power as opposed to the power of the Egyptian gods. And that's a part of what comes out. So that verse kind of gives a great theme for the whole book, and in that way, in chapter 6, it's reiterated very clearly that Yahweh is, and we'll get into that. The outline of the book is in two parts. You have the redemption from Egypt. That's the first half of the book. It's really the first 20, 21, 22 chapters where you're at, but 21. And then you have the second half of the book is Revelation with God, where He's teaching and instructing them about how to be a nation in a relationship with Him. Remember, now they establish this national covenant. They establish this law covenant, which the added element from the promise of Abraham is this: we're going to teach you how to be a nation before me. So the law covenant is really related to their national status. It's related to their ability to operate as a people of God among other nations. And so it has a very specific focus, and a lot of the instruction about their diet, a lot of their instruction about their clothing, a lot of instruction about how they live in the land, so they don't look the same as the other nations around them. God wants them to be distinct and separate, and so He creates a lot of instruction out of those restrictions. You don't want to look like the other nations. Here's how you're going to do it different, for that purpose, for that very purpose. Yeah, they're going to know who you are. They're going to know what you're about. They're going to know what you're not about. But we don't do the things you do. And there's a display in that. And so the second half of the book, again, is really, He establishes in chapter 20 the Ten Commandments, which is the basis of the law. It's, loving God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and loving your neighbor as yourself. And it's expanded into all the other categories, as well as establishing a place to worship in the tabernacle, and a picture of that as they build the tabernacle, how the worship aspect for the nation goes. So it's all in there in the two parts. Now, you break it up into small parts, smaller divisions, the need for redemption, preparation for the redemption, the actual redemption, and then the rescue or preservation of Israel. The second half is the revelation of the covenant, and then as God is teaching and instructing, and then how they kind of respond to that. Right? I mean, they end up saying, all that you have said we will do. And you get this amplified kind of picture of how that response goes, the good and the bad. So, that's the breakdown in the book of Exodus. First division, the need for redemption, really sets up, how the book starts. These are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob, and they came each one with his household. And so you get a genealogy which fits exactly with Genesis. It's no different, right? They get all the names of the tribes and the sons of Israel, and in verse 7 it says they were fruitful, right? And so you have the main point in 6 and 7 there, that Joseph died and all his brothers in that generation. And we have this 400 430-year gap in the time that these genealogies existed. And it says, but the sons of Israel were fruitful and increased in verse 7 and multiplied and became exceedingly mighty, so that the land was filled with them. Were they extra fruitful? Yeah, God implies that He is causing it to happen. And it sets up a problem, right? So that their fruitfulness, which sounds like a great blessing, becomes the very source of their problem, because in verse 8 it says, a king arose who over Egypt who did not know Joseph. So you have that familiar connection gone, protection, if you will. And he looks out in verse 9 and says, behold, the people of the sons of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come, let us deal wisely with them, lest they multiply, and in the event of war, they would join themselves to those who hate us and fight against us, right? And go up from the land. They're going to realize they're a political power if we ever have to go to war, and we don't know which side they'll be on. So we better be pretty shrewd about this. So they appointed taskmasters over them in verse 11. And these taskmasters then were to afflict them with hard labors, and so they built storage cities, the Pithom and Ramses. And I've seen some of the archaeology shows that you go into the building projects of these things, and they're crazy big buildings, crazy amount of people needed to build them. Without the additional slave labor, you never would have built these places in Egypt. Never. The only way you can do it is you need enough people to work the stone quarries and cut the rocks out and carry them down and float them down a river and build them back up miles away, and they did that. This is the time in the era that these things were built. And it's an evidence, if you will, historical evidence of just how big and mighty they were, because without enough people, you would never have built these places. And but in verse 12, the interesting thing is it says the more they afflicted them, right, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread out, so that they were in dread of the sun. We're going to beat them down and keep them. No, instead it makes them bigger and stronger. And so, that they're just like, yeah, we gotta get harder, and so they want to kill the children. And that's where you get into the whole problem in verse 15, where he says, let's talk to the midwives and see if we can just put to death the sons, try to keep this fruitfulness down. They don't go along with it, so he commands every baby to be, male baby to be thrown into the river. That's the way in which God preserves. In chapter 2, you'll get into the point where God is going to preserve Moses. So that's the need for redemption. You have a severe affliction from the Egyptians, which ends with, we're just going to start genocide by killing the babies so that they don't become a problem. Chapter 2, you get into the preparation, and this is the preservation of Moses, right? And so in the first few verses there, it talks about the fact that a man from the house of Levi went and took a daughter of Levi as a wife and conceived, and they bore a son. And so he ends up getting named by the very fact that they're going to preserve him in the water and float him down a boat. Pharaoh's daughter ends up taking him in and adopting him into the Pharaoh's household. And so that's the preservation that takes place into chapter 2. Right? So the first 10 verses kind of give that outline of how Moses was rescued. And not only rescued, but placed into a prominent position to be able to do something about it. Now, in verse 11 of chapter 2, it says, came about in those days when Moses had grown up, that he went out to his brothers and looked on their hard labors, of which he was not a part. And he saw an Egyptian striking a Hebrew, one of his brothers, and he turned this way and that, and he saw that there was no one around, so he struck down the Egyptian and hit him in the sand. He killed him, murdered him. It becomes known, and it becomes a big way in which now Moses has to run, and he has to flee from Pharaoh, who wants to kill him. And so that takes place in verse 15. He tried to kill Moses. Moses fled from the presence of Pharaoh and settled in the land of Midian, who, by the way, are related. And he sat down by a well. So he has this a couple of times, and this kind of fits the pattern that God did with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, as he says, the problem with allowing Moses to do anything too soon, Moses is going to think, maybe I can do this on my own, right? So you have these elements where Moses says, oh, I see the problem, the injustice, I'm going to solve it by my own hand, I'm going to kill this taskmaster, and God says, it ain't the way it's going to go. Not by your hand. So you got to go, and you got to get trained in the desert. And you need time, like 40 years. So he's 40 years old when it happens. He goes into the desert for 40 years. He comes back when he's around 80 years old to lead the people out of Egypt, right? So he needs that time in order to understand how God is going to be the one. He has to learn to trust God and to do it God's way and not his own way. And so verse 23 turns that corner where after Moses is out, it says it happens, he's encountered 23, 23, so I'm moving ahead. So it says in those days, I'm in the wrong chapter, no wonder it didn't make sense. Turn back in my Bible, there we go. Now it happened in the course of those many days that the king of Egypt died. The sons of Israel cried out because of their slavery. They cried out, and their cry for help because of their slavery rose up to God. God heard their groaning and remembered his covenant with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. So God saw the sons of Israel, and God knew them. So that's a pretty important aspect into how the whole activity takes place. And that knowledge is taking notice, paying attention to their cause. He's going to go into action. And so that's the setup for chapter 2, the preparation for the redemption. You go into chapter 3, and you have the continuing part, but Moses now gets his call, and as he's pastoring the flock of his father-in-law, Jethro, he appears, he sees the burning bush, right? It says in verse 2, chapter 3 and verse 2, the angel of Yahweh appeared to him in a blazing fire from the midst of the bush. And he looked, and behold, the bush was burning with fire, yet the bush was not consumed. And Moses said, I must turn aside and see this marvelous sight. Right? Verse 4, God calls to him, says, Moses, Moses. He says, here I am. Do not come here. How do we know that this is, number one, this is Yahweh in the bush? Do not come too close. Remove your sandals, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. And then he says in verse 6, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. So Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. And then the important aspect of that is that, in verse 14 he says, right, or verse 13, the question is asked. Moses said, behold, I'm about to go to the sons of Israel, and I will say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you. What is his name? And here you get they call the tetragrammaton. It's verse 14, I am who I am. God said to Moses, I am who I am, which is the literal translation of Yahweh. The word Yahweh. So God is naming himself here. He says, I am who I am. Thus you shall say to the sons of Israel, I am has sent me to you. And God furthermore said in verse 15 to Moses, thus you shall say to the sons of Israel, Yahweh, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and this is my memorial name from generation to generation. And so, like I said, I think the LSB does a great job of drawing it out, the importance of the name of Yahweh, and that he meant for us to know it, and he meant for us to understand. When he says, when I go to the sons of Israel and I say, the God of Abraham sent me, who is it? Yahweh, the God of Abraham, has sent you. And you're going to see that that's going to play out throughout the whole narrative. The importance of the name of God here, the memorial name forever. God uses it, Pharaoh uses it, Moses uses it, and it's going to become an interaction about Yahweh.
Do we have any idea how, 430 years is a long time for to be there. So a lot of times they'll forget about things of the past.
Mm-hmm.
So did they have a sense that who Yahweh was?
Yeah, probably in the same way that if you try to grade your kids on their knowledge of the founding fathers of America, how well they know it, most people are going to go, yeah, they wore wigs and they did this declaration thing, something about it. We were taught that at our school, kind of remember bits and pieces of it. I think you're disconnected to a sense. They know God, they know there's a promise, they know that God said He would do it, and I think that their knowledge from that point lacks. It really does. I don't think they're very well versed. So that's what he says in verse 16, right? Indeed, I care about you and what has been done to you in Egypt. That's the preparation of in chapter 3, and the importance of this interaction is about God explaining His name and saying that when we go into this land, don't confuse me with anybody else. It's Yahweh, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, who is doing all these things. And He cares. So in chapter 4, you get into Moses and his discussion about, I've tried this leadership thing before and it didn't go very well. And I'm just wondering, I'm not a very good public speaker, right? So he gives them these signs in preparation, with the sign of putting his hand in and bringing out his leprosy. And if they don't believe you with the 2 signs, also you can take some water from the Nile and pour it on dry ground. It'll become blood. And so he gives them the 3 signs that he talks about in chapter 4. Moses has, some more resistance to the point. He says, look, in chapter 4, verse 10, never been very eloquent, never been a man of words, and neither recently nor in times past. And since you have spoken to your slave, I am one with a hard mouth and a hard tongue. I'm just not good at it. Yahweh responds in verse 11. Yahweh said to him, who has made man's mouth, or who makes him mute or deaf or seeing or blind? Is it not I, Yahweh? You have a problem with speaking, that's because I did that. Now, if I want you to speak, it's because I want you to speak. I control your mouth. If you stutter, if you stammer, if you have a hard time. So even to the point of being deaf, mute, and blind, who's the one who causes those things? God does. So often in the book of in the Gospels, right, Jesus is confronting people in their hardness of heart because of people who are deaf and mute and blind, and they're going, it must be because they were a sinner. Well, if you go back to the beginning, God answers the question, who makes them mute and deaf and blind? Is it not I, Yahweh? He didn't say, oh, that was a mistake. That was a problem. He says, no, I'm the one who does these things. And by the way, if you have a hard time speaking, that's me. But guess what? When I want you to speak, you're going to be able to speak. And so he's teaching Moses about himself, and Moses has some lessons to learn. But even that, he says in verse 12, I will be with your mouth, and I will teach you what you need to say. And in the end, yes, I'll even give you Aaron. You need Aaron to come along. Aaron will come along for the ride, right? And but he puts Aaron in a pretty prominent position about that. And at the end of the day, again, chapter 4, verse 15, he's very adamant about the fact that God is going to be in control and God is going to be the one who performs all of these things, right? And so in verse 16, importantly, this is what he says as he's talking to him. He goes, Aaron's coming and he shall speak for you to the people, and he will become as a mouth for you. This is where you get the idea about what is a prophet, right? This is the first kind of explanation of what does it mean to be a prophet for the Lord. Well, he uses Aaron as a prototype. Aaron is going to be a prophet for Moses. And together, they're going to be a prophet for the Lord. Okay? There's a teamwork kind of a thing there. But he says, he will become as a mouth for you, and you will become as a God to him. That relationship of you have all the authority and power, Aaron just speaks for you. Aaron doesn't have any power on his own. Only when he's connected and speaking for you will he have this authority and power. You will be as a God to him. You have all the authority and power, Moses. Aaron works for you. It's a very clear relationship defined. And so when you begin to see that he's going to raise up Moses, and Moses is going, and he kind of says it, I think, later on. He says, when you go to Pharaoh, you're going to be like a god to him. You're going to be representing me. You're going to be my mouthpiece. You know, I'm going to make sure he sees you that way. So a lot of this thing about power revolves around the perceived power of gods, right? The Egyptian gods and their understanding of the world wrongly. And God is going to instruct them a little bit about that through the way he brings them out. So he departs and he goes into the wilderness and he goes back and he says his goodbyes to Jethro, and he says in verse 21 the explanation about how things are going to go. This is repeated several times, but Yahweh said to Moses, when you return to Egypt, see to it that all the miraculous wonders which I have put in your hand, that you do them before Pharaoh. But as for me, I will harden his heart with strength, so that he will not let the people go. Then you shall say to the Pharaoh, Israel is my son, my firstborn. And clearly he's to say to Pharaoh, thus says Yahweh, Israel is my son, my firstborn. So I said to you, let my son go that he may serve me, but you have refused to let him go. Behold, I will kill your son, your firstborn. The way you treat my son, my firstborn Israel, I'm going to do the same to your son. That's kind of the parallel of power exchange here. It says, you've been mistreating my firstborn son, I'm going to do the same to yours. And as the punishment and judgment, I will kill your son, your firstborn. So you have like a parallelism there that exists with how God is saying, this is how I look at Israel, as close as your firstborn son.
Is there anywhere in Genesis where it was mentioned that Israel, who's Jacob, is the firstborn?
Nope. Nope.
It just shows up.
Because he wasn't the firstborn.
No, he wasn't.
But he was chosen to be the firstborn by birthright, because he took the birthright. Remember, he grabbed onto the ankle to take it. And all of that taking was God's choice. That was God's choosing him to be the firstborn. See, for being firstborn doesn't have to do with your position by yourself, who you were born, how you were born. It's by God's choice. And so he establishes that.
It's just interesting that it starts with him and
not
with Isaac or Abraham.
Right, right. So by Jacob, he says, by my choice, my firstborn comes from him. And I view the whole nation now as my firstborn. Among all the other nations, this is the one I have chosen. It's kind of a choice, more about choosing than who they actually are. It's more important that you recognize that God chose them. And his choice comes with the benefit and blessing of it. And so that parallel, again, that exists, this power play between Pharaoh and Yahweh, God says, yeah, it's all about our firstborn. You're not dealing with my firstborn very well, and I'm going to enact a judgment on you that ultimately your firstborn will die. And so you have that interaction, and Moses gathers the people in verse 29. They listen to everything, and they bow low. Eventually they head back into the land. Chapter 5, you get the redemption of Israel. You move into the second category there, and chapter 5 begins the process of bringing the people out. And it goes this way. It says, afterward Moses and Aaron came and said to Pharaoh, thus says Yahweh, the God of Israel, let my people go, that they may celebrate a feast. And here's the key phrase. Pharaoh said, who is Yahweh that I should listen to him to let Israel go? I do not know Yahweh, and also I will not let Israel go. Then they said, the God of the Hebrews has met with us, and please let us go a 3 days' journey into the wilderness, that we may sacrifice to Yahweh our God, lest he confront us with pestilence or with the sword. And so you have this whole play, and a part of it is, and I think it's key, verse 2, Pharaoh says, who is Yahweh? I don't know him. You will know him. At the end, you're going to know all about him. And it's the naming part of it is, again, just as important here. God is introducing himself as a person with a name, Yahweh.
Did the Israelites and also Moses and Aaron really view this as a 3-day trip. I mean, why is there that lie? Because they weren't going to be gone for only
Well,
3 days.
the technicality is that Mount Sinai, if you go as the crow flies and by the fastest route, 3 days away. God never takes them that 3-day journey. But the distance to where they're going is a 3-day journey. He's just saying, look, they're just going to this mountain that I want them to go to. That's where I want them to go. It's just naming a specific place. I don't know if they don't tell them, but I don't know any better explanation. I don't know why. I know that even then, we'll get to the point when he takes them out, he says, I could take them by the 3-day journey, I'm just not going to do that. I'm going to take them down the hard route to prove a point.
But that was not the promised land, right? I mean,
It's in the edge of the promised land. If you go straight across, kind of the Gaza area, you can get there. God never takes them that route. They never go that route. Instead, he takes them down through the Gulf and crosses across the Gulf through a dry riverbed that caves them in on the left and the right, so they have no other place to go. And we'll get there. He actually explains it in the later chapter 19, I think, or somewhere, or 14. I think 14. He explains it. So, yeah, but it's setting up a litmus test in a sense. The best I can explain is like Pharaoh. It's just as simple. This is what I want them to do. Are they coming back? Are they going to keep going on? We don't tell you. They're just going to a 3-day journey. You better let them do it. He's just setting up that this is what he wants. I want my firstborn here. You better let him go. I mean, he could have said yes, and they could have just went the easy route, but God says no, but I'm going to harden his heart. Right? You're going to go and act as God before him. I'm going to be on the other side hardening his heart saying no. God is responsible for both sides of this, and he's the one in control. So you have that interplay in chapter 6. Just to move the narrative along, Yahweh said to Moses, now you shall see what I will do to Pharaoh, for by a strong hand he will let them go, and by a strong hand he will drive them out of his land. God further spoke to Moses and said to him, I am Yahweh, and I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as God Almighty, Adonai. But by my name Yahweh I was not known to them. But I will also establish my covenant with them to give them the land of Canaan, the land in which they sojourned. So you have, again, another reference to the importance of his name. It says, I was not known by this name before. Now I am going to be known by this name. And so he says in verse 6, say to the sons of Israel, therefore I am Yahweh, and I will bring you out from under the hard labors of the Egyptians and deliver you from their slavery. I will also redeem you with an outstretched arm. So this is how God is the main display of this redemption is Yahweh and who he is. So that gets you into chapter 6. As you go into chapter 7, you get into the confrontation there in verse 1 where Yahweh said to Moses, see, I have set you as God to Pharaoh, and your brother Aaron shall be your prophet. You shall speak all that I command you, and your brother Aaron shall speak to Pharaoh that he let the sons of Israel out of his land. So again, as this contest increases in intensity, this is the relationship. God says, you're going to be like God. He's going to be like your prophet. You're going to be the visible representative with all the authority and power, and you're going to be teaching him about me. And as this thing goes along, this is how I'm going to do it. And in the end result, in verse 5, then the Egyptians shall know for sure that I am Yahweh, when I stretched out my hand against Egypt and bring out the sons of Israel. So, one of the main points, he says, this contest is going to display something very clear. It was Yahweh who did all this. Yahweh said in verse 14, Pharaoh's heart's going to be hard. He's going to refuse to let the people go. After all the signs, and what happens is they're going to go through and they're going to perform now a series of contests, right? And that takes place in chapter 7, chapter 8, you have this contest that takes place where starts in chapter 7 and like verse 8 through 13, where the contest of the staffs becoming a serpent. And what it does is it sets up in Pharaoh's mind, if my magicians can duplicate the same kind of a thing, then I'm not impressed, right? I'm not going to be very impressed. And even if their staff and snake can eat all of my magicians' staffs and snakes, I'm still going to harden my heart. God hardens his heart, as it says in verse 13, and yet Pharaoh's heart was hardened with strength, and he did not listen to them, just as Yahweh had spoken. And so you have this contest. It starts with turning the water into blood, the plague of the frogs, and all the plagues start taking place. And kind of the point of them is that you have this contest between the gods of Egypt and the Yahweh, the God of Israel. So each of these plagues, like the plague on the Nile, which is turning the water to blood, the power over the Nile River, that was one of their most important aspects of their religious understanding, is that the Nile was their fertility. The Nile was their lifeblood. The Nile provided their crops. It provided for them. And so when God says, I have the power to take that away, and your God can't do anything about it, right? This is the contest that is kind of setting up. They had a God that represents every one of these plagues. You can look them up on the internet and probably see the charts of them, but it's a display and a contest of who has the power. And so that's what the 10 plagues are really doing, is they're saying at every point in your life, you Egyptians, you have no power. And in 10 plagues, I'm showing you how I have all the power over everything you think that your gods have power. They have none. And so he's really going to battle with the Egyptian gods, if you will, in a sense, their perception of their religious life, and saying, it's all phony, it's all fake. There's nothing to it. I have all the power. You have none. And that's the nutshell of what the plagues do. With the frogs, they get into it. The frogs come out, and it says there in verse 18, is it? Yeah. Verse 18, when the magicians tried to do the same thing with their secret arts to bring forth of the gnats, they could not, so that there were gnats on man and beast. And the magicians said to Pharaoh, this is the finger of God. They're going, yeah, we're done. We can't do this anymore. We lose. We can't duplicate. Only God can do this. And we're giving up, in a sense. We're backing away and saying, we recognize God. But for Pharaoh, he did not listen to him, right? And Pharaoh's heart was hardened with strength, that he did not listen to him, just as Yahweh had spoken. So you have this ratcheting up in the middle where it goes, yeah, we can't compete with Yahweh. We can't do this. And then you get a couple of times where Pharaoh's trying to end this whole power struggle, saying, listen, just the men can go, right? Go on out with the men. That's what you really wanted. Go out and worship. They said, nope, God said everybody's got to go. You got to do it God's way, or we can't listen to you, right? And so you have this whole pattern. Remember, he gives this fake repentance in chapter 9, verse 27, when he cries out and says, oh, I have sinned, And he says this phrase in 27, I have sinned this time. Yahweh is the righteous one. I and my people are the wicked ones. Please entreat Yahweh, for God's thunder and hail are too much, and I will let you go, and you shall stay no longer. And listen to what it says. And Moses said to him, as soon as I go out of the city, I will spread my hands to Yahweh, and the thunder will cease, and there will be hail no longer, that you may know that the earth is Yahweh's. But as for you and your servants, I know that you do not yet fear Yahweh God. And they knew, because even though the crops were destroyed, they had, it says the flax and the barley were struck down, but the barley was in the ear and the flax was in the bud. They had a second crop being ready to, the wheat and the spelt, the late harvest in verse 32 were getting ready to go. They knew they had some food coming. And so he's saying, yeah, you guys are afraid, but you're not starving. You're going to starve to death, and you know it, and so you're really not ready to listen to Yahweh. And so when he saw, he turns around, and in verse 35, his heart was hardened, and he doesn't let him go. So there was this false repentance, right, that takes place, and now in chapter 10, God says, Yahweh said to Moses, come to Pharaoh, for I have hardened his heart, and the heart of his servants with firmness, so that I may set these signs of mine among them, and that you may recount in the hearing of your son and of your grandson how I dealt severely with the Egyptians, and how I put my signs among them, that you may know that I am Yahweh. So you have this purpose. Again, God says this is all instructive, and the scope of what God is doing is so immense, right? With these powerful plagues and with the redemption He's about to accomplish. But He says, you're going to teach them to your generations. They're going to know the name of Yahweh. Verse 3. Then Moses said to Aaron, and Moses and Aaron came to Pharaoh and said to him, thus says Yahweh, the God of the Hebrews, how long will you refuse to humble yourself before me? Let my people go, that they may serve me. For if you refuse to let my people go, behold, tomorrow I will bring locusts to your territory, and they'll cover the surface of the land. And so you have this encounter, and again, He says, let the men go. They say no. We have to go with everybody. It has to be just the way God said it, or we can't go. He thinks He's dealing evil with him in verse 10. The whole contest, this is not happening now. So you have another encounter that doesn't go well, but He's saying you're going to remember all of these encounters. So that in chapter 11 and chapter 12, you have this importance of the last plague, the Passover, and the importance of how God institutes it as a remembrance. God is going to establish that this is their calendar, the beginning of their calendar event. You're going to know about, and you're going to center your whole understanding of me on these events. And He says in chapter 12, verse 1, Yahweh said to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, this month shall be the beginning of months for you. It is to be the first month of the year for you. What was it before this? I have no idea. But now we have the establishing of the Jewish calendar, where they start their year, where they start their calendar, and it begins with these events of the Passover. By the 10th day of the month, then they'll have the Passover.
So that's like in March. Is that the first of the...
It runs around that time, right? Our Easter, relatively to the Jewish calendar, kind of hits that same time frame of their Passover, and so that's why it rotates a little bit. They have a 30-day calendar, 30-day months, and it doesn't jive with our Roman calendar, so that's why it floats around a little bit. Yeah.
Is it 5784? The year now? From that's the start, and now it's 5784, I heard.
So this is roughly 1400 BC.
Oh.
1400 BC.
Oh.
When I think 1400 maybe Abraham, and then 1200. I'm trying to think. It's not much more than that. It's right around 1400 BC. I have to look it up to be sure. I haven't done that. But it's not 5,000 years. So you have roughly in the history of the world about 6,000 years. You have 2,000 years before the flood. You have 2,000 years between the flood and Jesus Christ coming down on the earth. And now you have about 2,000 years since Christ. So about 6,000 years roughly. I don't get into the exactness of it, but that's about how you can look at the biblical chronology. So, chapter 12, he establishes that all of the acts and the mighty acts that he's doing are going to culminate with this Passover. And it's going to be instructive, and you're going to teach about it, and you're going to remember it. And it's going to be a memorial for you throughout your generations. And so, as he describes in verse 23 there, kind of the outline of it, Yahweh will pass through to smite the Egyptians, and he will see the blood on the lintel and the 2 doorposts, which they kill the lamb, and they eat the lamb, and they use the blood to smear on their doorposts. And it says, if you do that, Yahweh will pass over the doorway and will not allow the destroyer to come into your house to smite you. And you shall keep this event as a statute for you and your children forever. One of the biggest things and part of the whole judgments that come around is when they don't keep Passovers and they don't keep Sabbaths. Okay? When they fail to do these things, God takes it pretty serious. If you go later on in the time of the exile, right, and God takes them out of the land to punish them for their disobedience. Do you know how long he calculated he would keep them out of the land? for all the Sabbath years that they never kept for him. He adds them all up and says, I remembered every single one of them. You're staying out until those are all caught up. So God does math. So this is, but this is what God says. You're going to keep this forever. And you're going to understand and you're going to know that when you enter into the land, verse 25, that Yahweh will give you as He has promised, you're going to keep this. And here's an interesting phrase, new slavery. That's in chapter 12. That's an interesting, I think some of them say it's a ritual or a rite you're going to keep or other things and versions. But the literal word is service or slavery. This is an obligation. Is really the idea here, obligation of service. And this is what he talks about in verse 25. Let me read it there. Yeah, you'll keep this event as a statute for your children to be forever, and it will be that when you enter the land which Yahweh will give you as He has promised, you shall keep this new slavery. And it will be that when your children say to you, what is the meaning of this new slavery to you? That you shall say, it is a Passover sacrifice to Yahweh, who passed over the house of the sons of Israel in Egypt when He smote the Egyptians, but He delivered our homes. And so the people bow low and worship. And the idea there is that, just like we've been talking about on Sunday nights, if you've been there, you've been freed from sin and enslaved to God. The same picture of His redemption here. He says, I'm freeing you from the Egyptians and enslaving you to me. I'm obligating you to me. It's not just a free will choice. I'm really rescuing you for the point that you're going to be serving me. Obligated. So that the literal translation of the word is slavery, but the emphasis of it is on the obligation of it. I'm obligating you to me. It's not free. You guys are tied together. I'm bringing you out. You're mine. Possessing you. Right, and maybe there's some places in the Old Testament where He says, you are my possession, ownership. On your side, obligation, slavery. So that's the relationship He's establishing in the second half of the book, is what is this new slavery? What is this new relationship between God and His people? It's a very strict obligation. So in chapter 12, verse 49, he talks about it here in this way. He says, this same law shall apply to the native as to the sojourner who sojourns among you. And so all the sons of Israel did as Yahweh had commanded Moses and Aaron, thus they did. And on that same day, Yahweh brought the sons of Israel out of the land of Egypt by their hosts. And so you have this picture of how God is contracting them to Him in a sense, right? And establishing that relationship. As I bring you out, remember there's a relationship status here that you got to remember, and I'm going to teach you all about it. Chapter 13, it goes in and says in verse 17, as they go through and they're saved, and they're getting their rescue, they're setting up this whole thing. It says in verse 1, sanctify to me every firstborn, the first offspring of every womb among the sons of Israel, both man and beast, it belongs to me. So even this picture of setting apart, this picture of separation, that he says, here's an offering to God. This is how you need to understand the price, right? There's the price pay, the firstborn of every offspring. And that picture is, you are the firstborn among all the nations. Just like you offer up the firstborn to me, the whole nation is the firstborn among all the nations. And so they're dedicated or set apart, sanctified unto the Lord. So he establishes all of these pictures are going to play out in the way that he teaches about the law. It's all established here at Exodus in the beginning of the nation. And everything has a visual picture and a visual reminder about how it's going to go. And so he sets that up. And chapter 13, if you go to the other side, this is what I was talking about earlier, Kim. 17, it says, it happened that when Pharaoh did let the people go, God did not guide them by the way of the land of the Philistines, which would have taken probably that 3-day journey. He did not do that. And it says, instead, even though it was near, Because God said, lest the people change their minds when they see war and return to Egypt. If I take them by the coastal route, it's easy to say, we give up, we'll just go back to Egypt. God says, I'm going to put you in a place where you have nowhere to go, literally. I'm going to box you in on every direction, and the only thing you're going to see is the Egyptian army coming at you. That's it. You can't go to the left, you can't go to the right. You could drown out in the sea, but you have no choice. So he says, take them by the land of the Philistines. That'd be the easy route. We're going to do it the hard way. God says we're not pushing the easy button. We're going to go the hard button. And it's for a display. Again, God doesn't do it without purpose. And so it says, God, in verse 18, turned the people to the way of the wilderness to the Red Sea, and the sons of Israel went up in battle array from the land of Egypt. And so, as it goes along and you read the story, and if you do the research, they have all these dry riverbeds that have, 50-foot walls, 100-foot walls at times. It's like a cavern, like a little path, dry riverbed that's carved out, and probably from the flood. And these people are traveling down, and you can see the videos and the archaeology of them these days. You can drive vehicles down them, and but there's really nowhere to. Once you're in there, there's nowhere to go. You either back up and go out, or you move forward. You can't go to the left or the right. And that's exactly what God did by design. He said, you're going to be trapped, so you have no choice. You're either going to fight the Egyptians, or you're going to flee into the sea, or you're going to see what I might do about this.
So Canaan is in present-day Israel.
Mm-hmm.
And the Philistines would have been around that area.
Yep, the Philistines are always identified as kind of the strip along the sea. They were a seafaring people, and so they are always identified by being right along the coast. They never went inland too far. They always stayed, because they like boats, they always stayed by the sea. And so even in the land of Canaan, the land of the Philistines would have been, they should have came out of Egypt and just went right along the coast of the Mediterranean and up.
So Goshen is east of the Nile River, so
Mm-hmm.
it would have been easy for them.
That's the delta areas, yeah.
That's a 3-day route all the way up to Israel, but instead God had them cross the Red Sea and go into, that Saudi Arabia.
We're from Michigan, right? So we can do Egypt and Israel that way.
Yeah.
He could have took them along the top part like that and said that's the easy route. Instead, he took them south and around to a dead end against the whole Gulf Sea, right? So it wasn't just a little river they were crossing. It was a giant thing that was impossible unless God's going to do something. You only have two choices. They're going to send the army down that riverbed to destroy you, or you jump into the sea, which it's not an option for 2.5 million people, So that's kind of what God does on purpose. So that's where I see he's describing here. I could have took him that 3-day journey, but I'm going to teach him a lesson. And he planned that the whole time. But so to say that they were going a 3-day journey is true. He's just going to take the long way, the scenic route. Like you ever go to the Smoky Mountains and say, "Oh, that'd be fun. I'll take the scenic route." 8 hours later. So, that's kind of how it goes. Now Yahweh spoke to him in chapter 14, and just to move, right, this is as they're crossing, speak to the sons of Israel so that they turn back and camp before Pehirith-Hoth, between Migdol and the sea, and they shall camp in front of Baal-Zephon opposite by the sea, and Pharaoh will say to the sons of Israel, they are wandering in confusion. Basically, he took them by the worst possible route to escape. It would make no sense. And this is all on purpose. Let's take 2.5 million people and take them into a desert, dry riverbed with no food and water and no place to go. Pharaoh's going to look at that and say, what in the world are they doing? Nobody would do this. Why? They must be confused. And so Pharaoh's like, well, they're too stupid. We're going to go after them. We're going to take them back. It's going to be too tempting for Pharaoh. It's going to be easy to get them back. So he goes out there and says, yep, what were we thinking? What were we thinking? Let's go get them back. And so God sets it up for all the way that he directed them, instead of the easy way, 3-day journey, the hard direction, no way to get there journey. And they could never have gotten there, never have crossed, ever. Would never have worked. He took them up against a sea that they could never, it would have been impossible for them to cross. And then they cross. So God's outstretched hand and great power allows them. And as it says in verse 4, thus I will be glorified through Pharaoh and his army, so that all the Egyptians will know that I am Yahweh. Yahweh saved Israel that day in verse 30, chapter 14 and verse 30, and from the hand of the Egyptians. And Israel saw the Egyptians dead on the seashore. Thus Israel saw the great hand which Yahweh had used against the Egyptians, and the people feared Yahweh. And they believed in Yahweh and in his servant Moses. So the result is God says, I did it the hard way because you need to learn the lesson, and they do. They get, God is a pretty good teacher. He knows what we need. Good and bad, hard, good and difficult. And he teaches them exactly what he wanted them to know. And so the statement there just says, and they got the point. And so they sing the song in chapter 15, the song of Moses. I will sing to Yahweh, for he is highly exalted. The rider and the horse and the rider he has hurled into the sea. Yahweh is my strength and song, and he has become my salvation. This is my God, and I will praise him. My father's God, and I will extol him. Yahweh is a warrior, and Yahweh is his name. And so they praise Yahweh in this song. And the end result there in verse 20, as it says, it's wrapping up. Miriam and the prophetess, Aaron's sister, took the tambourine in her hand, and all the women went out with her dancing. Miriam said, sing to Yahweh, for he is highly exalted. And Moses had Israel set out from the Red Sea, and they went out into the wilderness, and so their journey continues, right? So that's kind of where we have to end, and we'll pick up from there and move along this instruction time of establishing this nation of Israel, the preservation of Israel in the wilderness. Father, we thank you for this time, and I pray that it is instructive to us as well, and that we understand and know who you are from this. Your great power, that you can do anything that you please. The whole earth is yours, and no nation can stand before you. Help us to trust you in everything. In Jesus' name, amen.
You're gone next week?
I'm gone next week. They'll have discussion classes available. You're going to do the normal lesson time.